So, I want to give as much as possible a very direct, matter of fact explanation of nuclear testing and why we really don't need to conduct any live nuclear tests. And along with that will come some discussion of the effects of nuclear weapons and a decent bit of discussion on how they work. And I don't want to be sort of melodramatic, but I also don't want to, completely sanitize, the topic, because these are the most horrific weapons that humanity has ever created, and their effects are well known to be devastating and horrible. And I will briefly get into, parts of why, but, suffice it to say that sort of, public consensus that nuclear weapons would be absolutely devastating if ever used, and would lead to the likely end of human civilization and the possible end of the human species. So, I am unfortunately talking about this because a couple weeks ago, as of now, the Trump administration announced that the United States is going to resume nuclear testing. It is as yet unclear what they mean by that. However, it is looking more and more like they do actually mean live tests of nuclear weapons with the fissile material, so an actual nuclear explosion, not just tests of the components that is what we do right now, without creating an actual nuclear chain reaction that has a large yield and causes a nuclear explosion. So, the main reason that we don't need to test our weapons is exactly what I just said, which is that we are able to test the components, and crucially, the designs have not changed in 40 years. Right? The last time the United States conducted a nuclear test, it was about 2 years after I was born in 1992. I was born in 1990. And since then, we have not conducted a single live test of an actual nuclear weapon with the fissile material, right? With the actual nuclear fuel inside of the bomb. And the main reason for that, of course, is that the Cold War ended, and we signed various treaties with former members of the Soviet Union, basically Russia, and other nuclear armed powers, our allies in China, to ban the testing of nuclear weapons. Now, that's, again, mostly because of the ramping down in hostilities, and of course, ultimately, the reasons for resuming testing would be sort of geopolitical and not technical, but I do want to sort of explain from a technical point of view why testing is entirely unnecessary and why it would not provide us with any information we don't already have about the reliability of the weapons. Right? Because there's another thing to consider, right? Which is that, in any device, you can use it 1,000 times and it can work 1,000 times, and then number 1001 can be the dud, right? You can never have a 100% guarantee of anything working, but you can add a lot of nines to the 99.999999% level of confidence. And the degree of additional confidence that we would gain from additional tests is essentially zero. Because, as I said, the designs of the weapons have not changed since 1992, right? In fact, it's a very important principle of modern sort of nuclear weapons stockpile stewardship that you don't want anything to change, because we want to keep everything in the weapon design exactly the same, so that if, God forbid, ever push the button, the weapon would work as designed, right? And of course, the reason for that is we want to be able to assure strategic planners that the weapons will work, so that we have a credible deterrent without the need to escalate and build even more weapons to account for a lack of reliability. But that reliability is very, very high, and we know that both from the tests that we did conduct when we were still changing the designs back during the Cold War, and because we are able to do simulations of the weapon going off, and in so doing, we're able to validate, based on these numerical simulations, that assuming the laws of physics don't suddenly change, the weapon will indeed work as designed, because the processes that it involves will all happen as expected. Because I guess I now briefly have to get into how a nuclear weapon actually works to explain what the tests that we currently conduct are. So, every nuclear weapon consists of at least 2 stages. Most of them consist of sort of approximately, 3.5. But the first two that are always present is you have conventional high explosives, right? So something like TNT. Or another high explosive. It's not actually TNT, it's a mixture of different high explosives, but high explosives that just undergo a chemical reaction and, release, a substantial amount of energy, but not a nuclear amount of energy, right? Explosives have, yields that are on the order of megajoules per kilogram, right? And nuclear material has yields that are on the order of terajoules per kilogram. So, we set off those, conventional explosives that are quite literally 1,000,000 times less powerful than the actual nuclear weapon itself. And those conventional explosives are going to compress a bunch of nuclear material, a bunch of fissionable nuclear material, so a combination of uranium, plutonium, and other fissionable isotopes, as well as some other things mixed in there, most of which is various forms of fusion fuel and ways of generating extra neutrons, because it's neutrons that induce nuclear fission, the splitting of atomic nuclei, which releases the energy in a nuclear fission reaction. And so in order to make that happen, you have to get the material very dense, so they use conventional explosives to create an inwardly collapsing shock wave that compresses the nuclear material until it exceeds the critical point, right, which, there's people always talk about something going critical, right? Because the critical point is like the tipping point, right? So a piece of fissionable material that can undergo a nuclear fission reaction, it is subcritical if it is not large enough or dense enough to undergo a fission reaction that is self-sustaining, right? And when it's right at the critical point, that is where the reaction will be self-sustaining, right? So it will neither increase nor decrease the reaction rate. It will just be stable. So subcritical, the reaction just completely, tapers off. Critical, the reaction will be self-sustaining but won't accelerate, which is the point where a nuclear reactor operates. And then in a nuclear weapon, you need a supercritical state. Technically, reactors are also supercritical, but they're just barely supercritical. And then there's other things that slow the reaction back down. And things that are, very robust, and there is no possibility of a nuclear reactor having a nuclear explosion. They can have other failures, but none of the reactors that have failed have been a nuclear explosion. That's something very different, where they just have sort of mechanical failure. They're, related to the energy involved, but they're ultimately sort of mechanical failures. And the conventional explosives in a nuclear weapon are used to get that compression and get that supercritical state, and have to get very deeply supercritical, right? So it has to be to a very, very high density. So what we do in our existing tests is we just take out the nuclear material, right? It's fairly straightforward. We just take the plutonium, uranium, and other substances that are inside the center of the bomb, and we replace them with materials that are inert in terms of nuclear reactions. So, instead of using uranium, plutonium, and other nuclear fission fuel, they use something that's inert, like, say, lead. What they actually use is a complicated mixture of different, very dense metals that have the same properties as the plutonium and uranium. And, the combinations that they use in both the live weapons and in these inert test centers are very, very classified. But, it's going to be some similar material that's got the same density and that responds to very high temperatures and pressures in a similar manner to the actual live nuclear pit, that core of fissionable material. And so what they do is they take that fissionable material, and after they've replaced it with the inert material, they then also wire up the interior of the weapon with, or the test article that's inert. It's not totally inert because it does have high explosives, but it does not have any nuclear components. And what they do is they set off the conventional explosives and they measure the pressure profile of that inwardly collapsing shock wave, right? Because the purpose of that shock wave is to collapse in and force the nuclear material into a very dense, highly compressed state where it's supercritical. And so they essentially just measure how much the non-nuclear material with the same density and same properties gets compressed. And by doing that, they can then feed that data into a simulation and validate in terms of sort of, other laws of physics and empirical experiments we do, right? So they measure, how plutonium and uranium respond to neutrons in a nuclear reactor, right? Because again, it's neutrons impacting a nucleus is what causes a fission event generally. It's what causes an induced fission event. There's also always some probability of spontaneous fission, right? That's part of how the reaction gets going in the first place. Is there's always a very small number of atoms that will spontaneously fission and emit neutrons, but most of the atoms in a nuclear chain reaction are undergoing induced fission, where a neutron hits them, and then the nucleus splits and it releases more neutrons to continue the chain reaction. So instead of doing that in a bomb, we can do that in a nuclear reactor and measure how plutonium and uranium respond to different neutron fluxes at different energies. And we can, look at how plutonium and uranium respond at those same high temperatures and pressures, but without putting them in a bomb, just putting them in sort of a little test cell and taking a very small piece of them. And they can take all of this data and feed it into very sophisticated computer simulations that are going to validate that, assuming the laws of physics don't magically change one day, that the weapons will work as designed if anybody ever pushes the button. There's yet another reason that we don't need to test, though, which is that, like I said, the designs have not changed since 1992. So they also conducted the same experiments I'm describing right now back in the original Cold War, right? And they also measured the pressure profile of the inwardly collapsing shockwave. And so in addition to feeding the data from that, test involving only conventional explosives into a computer simulation, they're able to validate that the laws of physics say the weapon should work, but they're also able to just compare it to the same exact experiment that was done, in parallel with the live nuclear test, right? They would do the same thing, except they would do an actual, live nuclear test in parallel, right? So if you set off the conventional explosives, measure the pressure profile, and then you set off the actual nuclear weapon, and it works, right? Then it stands to reason that if you are able to replicate the profile of that inwardly collapsing shockwave, that you can be sure that it will have the same effect, assuming you keep all of the designs of the geometries and compositions of the nuclear fissionable material pit the same as well, which those are also sort of locked in place. The designs cannot change. They're not allowed. They're as a engineering rule, are not allowed to change. And so we can have a very high degree of confidence, a 99.99999% confidence that if, God forbid, we ever push the button, the weapon will indeed go off. And conducting a live test really wouldn't add any more nines to that confidence. And in fact, to add significantly more nines, you would have to conduct really a lot of tests. And you might also think, well, if the designs have been frozen since 1992, aren't they a little out of date? And the answer to that is actually no as well, because nuclear fuel is, in one way, no different than regular fuel, right? There's a lot of ways in which it is very different, but it has one very simple thing in common, which is that you cannot burn more than 100% of it, right? You can add more fuel, but at a certain point, if you're burning 100% of it, that's kind of it, right? And bombs are not designed to extract the energy into any usable form. They're just designed to emit it all as thermal energy. And so there are a couple of subtleties with a nuclear reaction where you want the reaction to release energy as heat that will be immediately absorbed by the surrounding environment, there is a tendency with fusion reactions to emit a lot of the energy in high energy neutrons. But they also, already figured out how to optimize that long before the end of the Cold War, right? Before the 90s, really by the mid 70s, they had reached a point where they were burning essentially 100% of the nuclear fuel, right? Because again, there's just is a certain amount of plutonium, uranium, and various other nuclear fuels in the bomb, and at a certain point, you're burning close to 100% of it, and you really can't improve the yield and efficiency. And at that point, if you want a bigger bomb, add more material. If you want a smaller bomb, add less material. There's several caveats to that. There's actually a limit on the size of a pure fission bomb, but once you add fusion, it's possible to sort of daisy chain together multiple stages of fusion and fission, increasing the power each time. And so there is no actual upper limit on the size of a nuclear weapon other than sort of utility and practicality insofar as any nuclear weapon. Well, nuclear weapons do have a utility as a deterrent, and in that capacity, weapons above a certain size no longer provide any additional deterrence. A few hundred kilotons is adequate for any purpose. I mean, remember, when I talk about a kiloton, right, that is the equivalent of 1,000 tons of TNT, which, I think 1 kiloton is, I'm trying to remember, I can't remember if 1 kiloton is a quarter of a petajoule, or if it's a quarter of a terajoule, or if it's, I think 1 kiloton is 4 terajoules. Yeah, somewhere thereabouts. So, substantial. Because remember, a terajoule is 10 to the 12th joules, so, a million. Because remember, I said high energy chemical fuels usually have on the order of 1 megajoule per kilogram, and nuclear fuels have on the order of a terajoule per kilogram. Again, roughly, within a power of 10, the actual energy density can vary a little bit. So we really wouldn't gain any additional information, and also there's not really anything that we can improve about the designs anymore in terms of their destructive power, because they figured out quite a while ago how to burn essentially 100% of the nuclear fuel and to make the bomb as large or as small to some degree as they want. There's not really an upper bound other than, there's not much use in a 100 megaton bomb. There is a little bit of a lower bound, but there's also not much use for a nuclear bomb with yields less than 1 kiloton, because at that point you can just use conventional explosives and spare yourself all the complexity and ramifications of using a nuclear weapon. So, the only thing that's left after that is to optimize the percentage of the bomb's energy that gets turned into a blast. And again, blasts are, they are complicated in their own way, but it's like, usually there's this problem in engineering of, things constantly getting turned into waste heat, right? But in this case, the goal is waste heat, right? We're just trying to turn 100% of it into the thermal energy of the air to make, a giant fireball followed by a blast wave. And it's not that hard to get pretty close to 100% efficiency on that account either. There are some caveats with when you have fusion and fission both inside of the weapon, but by and large, it's not terribly difficult. In fact, the so-called neutron bomb, which indeed that is a horrific weapon, and it's a good thing it was stopped. But that's actually what happens when you have a weapon that's designed to deliberately emit most of its energy in high energy neutrons that will dissipate their energy into the atmosphere, but they do it over a much larger distance, and that's undesirable for creating a blast. But if you want to try to irradiate things, then you could do it that way. Those are, the Carter administration banned those weapons for good reason, and it's because the only conditions under which you can realistically get a weapon banned, which is when it's a combination of horrific and doesn't really confer any advantage, because a neutron bomb is designed to kill people by irradiating them with neutrons. The original concept was to short out electronics using neutrons. That really won't work with modern electronics, not at any neutron density that would be, achievable outside of the blast radius, because the point is to have, neutrons that can penetrate through, lots of, because they get absorbed more slowly, they also can pass through more Earth, so you can, irradiate everybody in a bunker or something. But you could also just, drop a nuclear warhead, on top of their bunker and collapse all the entrance tunnels and, let them suffocate. So, again, it's not that for a weapon to get banned, it has to be both, horrific and not particularly useful. It's why we also don't why we also ban chemical weapons is because they are absolutely horrific, and they also don't really convey any advantage. Regular nuclear weapons, not neutron bombs, are probably the most horrific weapons in existence, but they're also the most effective weapons in existence. So, banning them is going to be a very difficult, long, slow process that will probably only happen when the world is a much more peaceful place than it is today. And, for that matter, we should be aspiring towards that world, which is why this sort of new development is so upsetting, right? And if I were to, venture a guess, I would say that this is not about validating from a technical point of view that our weapons work, because, as I've explained, we really don't need to conduct any tests. On some level, it doesn't matter how long it's been since the, last time we conducted a test, because, again, the designs haven't changed, and it's not like the same, physical weapons have been sitting on a shelf for 40 years. It's been the same designs, right? But they sort of remanufacture the components, right? They very slowly take out the oldest, weapons and replace them with new ones that are identical in every way, but that have just been made, fresh to order, sort of. Well, not to order. They're made fresh using the exact same design. They're made fresh, not to order. Made fresh to copy exactly the weapon design that we already know works for all the reasons I've already mentioned. There is one minor caveat to that, which is that we have replaced some of the sort of peripheral components. That's why I actually used to work on a related projects to that, because I used to work at Sandia National Laboratories, and when I was working there, I learned a lot about the sort of how these testing procedures work, but I didn't work on any of these tests. I worked on silicon photonics research, which is very sort of far upstream of the stuff I'm talking about. But Sandia works on all the electronics that do the arming and firing for nuclear weapons, which includes all of the safing systems. That's why Sandia has the always never saying, which is that a weapon should always work if, God forbid, somebody ever pushes the button. However, it should never fire if we are not intending that, right? We should never have an accidental detonation, and knock on wood, we never have had one, right? Sandia has, done good work over many decades to ensure that, the number of nines in the confidence level that we will not have an accidental detonation is actually even larger than the number of nines that we have for confidence that they would work if we ever needed them to, right? We have never had an accidental test. We have never had an accidental firing of a nuclear weapon. And for that matter, it has been many years since we have had a failure of a live fire. And I mean, even in the context of when we were doing testing, right? So those most recent tests had essentially a 100% success rate. And you have to look all the way back to like the 1950s to find tests that had any significant failure rate whatsoever. So we have high degree of confidence they will work, high degree of confidence that they will remain safe if there's an accident or something that, although there might be, a bit of quite a mess made, and need to sort of clean it up and secure the weapon if, an aircraft carrying one crashes or something, there will not be an accidental nuclear explosion. So, if there's nothing technical to be gained from doing a test, why conduct one? And the answer is as obvious as it is horrible, which is just to remind everybody that we have them, right? It's, from a technical point of view, we won't learn anything we don't already know. We already have all the data we need to feed both into our simulations and to compare to the existing test data that we have. And that's actually, if he wants to talk about how, great America is and, the wonderful things we have. What we do have, we actually don't have the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and it wouldn't really be a point of pride to have the world's largest, because the reason that Russia has more than the United States was because the Soviet Union was always behind the United States on guidance systems and warhead miniaturization. So they had a bunch of horrifically inaccurate, delivery systems, and so they had had to have both more bombs and larger bombs because they weren't as confident that they would land on their intended target. We have always had, or at least since the mid 60s when the Soviet Union surpassed the U.S. in warhead count. Since then, Russia or the Soviet Union has always had more than the U.S. And in fact, we actually peaked in the early 60s, and we started decreasing our warhead count pretty much right away after we reached the sort of optimum that I'm talking about, where you reach close to 100% efficiency and you reach very high reliability. We weren't quite all the way there until the mid 70s, but by the early 60s they were actually already pretty close. And also by the late 60s they had gotten guidance systems to be very good, because neither side had very good guidance systems in the early 60s, but by the late 60s we'd quite literally flown to the moon, right? So we knew how to build inertial navigation systems that work out in space. And so we could, deliver a nuclear weapon, within, a quarter mile of the intended target on the other side of the planet. And if you drop something within a quarter mile of ground zero, there's nothing on Earth that can survive even a small weapon. So at that point, there's no point in having a bunch of extras or increasing their yield further, because there is nothing on Earth that can survive a 100 kiloton blast at, 0 meters of distance, right? So there's really no value in having more or larger weapons at that point. And so you'd think if he'd be proud of something, it would be the fact that we don't have the world's largest arsenal, but what we do probably have is the world's best infrastructure for validating that our weapons actually work, right? Because we have the best scientists and engineers in the world. That's not, me bragging about America, although don't get me wrong, America, but we really do. We have, the brain honestly, some of it is brain drain is real, but it's also just it's been a priority in the United States, right? We do prioritize science and engineering. I wish we sort of emphasized and appreciated it more sometimes, especially sort of actually understanding science and technology, but c'est la vie. And we do have the I would say the best scientists and engineers in the world, because people come here from all over the world, and also because we have a lot of domestic STEM graduates who are pretty talented, to be honest. And we have the national laboratories, so we know our weapons will work without ever needing to test one. And you'd think that he would be proud of that, right? But that would require this sort of understanding of it. But I don't want to just hark on, Donald Trump bad, because something I, kind of would like to emphasize is something that's relatively obvious, but nonetheless bears repeating, right? That if we do actually test some of our weapons, then Russia and China will test some of theirs, right? Because, what sparked all of this off was that Russia tested a delivery system for nuclear weapons, which was also nuclear powered. However, it did not contain an actual nuclear warhead, right? And crucially, no nuclear warheads were, set off. And I don't know if he understands the difference between those things. It's, I'm not going to speculate as to the contents of his brain, but based on the lack of clarifying statements and sort of the fact that this has been on a lot of people's minds for a while, I would say that we most likely are going to test. And once we do test, because again, the test is not about validating that our weapons work, it's about reminding people that we have them. And so therefore, China and Russia will have to do the same, and then we'll go into the same escalating spiral that we did during the first Cold War, and hopefully we will also survive this one. But arms races are like drunk driving. You can get away with it once or twice, but you roll the dice enough times, eventually they're gonna come up snake eyes, right? And that'll be it. Except we're talking about the entirety of human civilization. Uh, this is a topic I've always kind of had a morbid fascination with, not least because the thought, again, not to be melodramatic, but this is literally what we are talking about, right? Is everybody that you've ever known or cared about just dying in the span of probably less than 24 hours. Um, Maybe some of them would survive, but um, it's not like other fears. Like it's good to be afraid of things that are hazardous. I'm not trying to dwell on it, but um, I mean, I don't want to say I don't care if I die, but um, it's just never been something that really worries me. But the thought of everybody I've ever known or cared about dying all at once, and there being a slim chance that uh, any of them would make it, and it not being even a guarantee that any human being would survive, because um, how bad the after effects of a nuclear war would be depends immensely on exactly how it plays out. But suffice it to say, it would be extremely terrible. Every major population center on Earth would be hit at least once. Um, Immediate death toll would be, in the hundreds of millions to billions. Um, I would probably estimate the short-term death toll at about 1 billion, and the survival rate for humanity after 10 years being, I don't think it would be 0, but it would probably be less than 10%. It's a very horrifying thought. Um, the effects of the blasts themselves are horrific. The effects of the fallout is horrific. The effects on society from destroying all the infrastructure and people are horrific. Um, yeah, it suffice it to say it would not be good. Um, and again, I'm not trying to be like Donald Trump bad, but part of what I want to emphasize is that these things have a life of their own, and it doesn't really I mean, it does matter if there's a change in political leadership in 2028, or for that matter in 2026, if there's a change in the prevailing political mood in the midterms. Um, if Donald Trump starts testing our nuclear weapons, Russia and China will test theirs, and then Donald Trump's successor, whether they are a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or something else, they will also continue testing. The only difference might be the rate at which we test our weapons might be slightly different from one party to the other, but whether or not there will be testing will not. It will just be a question of how many tests are conducted, and we'll be rolling the dice with the end of the world for another several decades, with no guarantee of making it through this again. And all of that essentially for nothing. Um, I guess I'm getting more into my opinions here, but I grew up in a world where it was kind of a moment for me when I found out nuclear weapons existed, but I found out about them at a time when we were getting rid of them, and so I learned of it as this sort of horrific thing from humanity's past that we were was still very frightening, but that we were slowly but surely moving past. And over the course of the last 10 years, things have gone from being that to much more so being an increase in escalation, an increasingly escalating return to hostilities. And that's honestly been the case since, the original invasion of Crimea. That was sort of the uncorking of the bottle, right? Because there had been this, through the 90s, it looked like things were getting better. Through the 2000s, things were a little bit shaky because of the aftermath of 9/11 and, Putin's rise to power in Russia. And in the 2010s, things were sort of, in the first half of the 2010s, things were, increasingly uneasy. But until 2014, it seemed like, maybe this was just, a back and forth in the context of, the sort of post-Cold War world, but that it wouldn't be a return to that type of arms race. But honestly, since the invasion of Crimea, it's been a sort of, it's been all downhill. And, it's not to be all, blah, 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 Putin bad either, although also Putin is a horrible person, and, invaded Ukraine for basically no reason other than, he wanted it. Not that there's zero strategic value, but, ultimately it was just, he is a dictator. He wanted control of more territory. Yeah. And so I don't want to be fatalistic either, because we've been on this trajectory for a while, and I'd like to think that it won't actually come to nuclear testing, and I also should like to think if it does, it won't come to nuclear war, but neither of those is a guarantee, and the former is looking increasingly likely, and the latter is not looking likely, but, like I said, the number of nines that you have, it's like the number of nines we have on the probability of human survival has been going down, right? And that's the sort of thing where, when we're talking about just the bare survival of the human species, you would want as many nines as possible, right? And I'd say we're very quickly dropping from 99.9 to 99 to 90, as time goes on here, which is extremely concerning when you're talking about, again, just the basic survival of the entire species. The fact that that's even sort of on the table via something that's under our control, because, we could always get hit by a meteor tomorrow, although we should also give more funding to NASA and look for all the asteroids in the solar system to try to prevent that as well. But, there are sort of proverbial acts of God that there's nothing we can do about, but this is different because this is entirely in our control, right? We can choose to not use them, and we can even choose to get rid of them, or we could choose to build more of them, and we could choose to use them, right? It's not like, something comes hurtling in from space. It is entirely up to human beings, what we decide to do here. So it's, for something that's in our control, we should not be willing to accept that level of risk, in my opinion. And again, I don't think it necessarily is going to stop just because Donald Trump is no longer president. Don't get me wrong, he's horrible. This isn't yet another example of the sort of irresponsible decisions that he makes, but it's not just another, Donald Trump did a bad thing, right? He does lots of bad things, but most of them are reversible, right? They're definitely bad. They cause a lot of suffering. I don't want to downplay the misery that a lot of his policy decisions can cause, but they're all things we can fix, right? We can fix almost all of that later, right? Especially things where it's just, funding and stuff. It's like, yeah, that's not great, and there is some permanent damage because staff will leave some places and not return when funding returns. But ultimately, it's like, we can reopen all these different agencies later. Nuclear weapons, there's no going back, right? Once the testing has started, there's no going back because we'll have started a new arms race. And once you actually push the button, there's absolutely no going back. There's no way to recall the weapons, and the effects will be devastating and last at minimum several decades. So, yeah, I don't know. It's also particularly senseless because, there's a reason that the United States and Russia both have large arsenals, but everybody else has the exact same size, right? Most countries have the same arsenal size, which is about 300 warheads. And the reason is that is enough to target every major city on Earth with a strategic warhead that would be absolutely devastating. And beyond that, all you're really doing is putting up a bunch of silos and air bases and have them all be pointed at each other, which is actually not necessarily destabilizing, although it's definitely a bad thing. We would be better if we didn't have all those extras. And in fact, they don't really offer a significant additional deterrence because, we always, especially once you have a nuclear armed ballistic missile submarine, because a ballistic missile submarine cannot be targeted in sort of, first strike because it's underwater and the other side doesn't know where it is. So, there's a degree of stability brought by that because a lot of the reason that a nuclear war would start is if you think that you're being attacked and you want to launch your nuclear weapons before they're destroyed on the ground. Well, if they're underwater and nobody knows where they actually are, that's not a concern, right? And they can always retaliate later. So that makes it less likely for us to use our other weapons. And depending on the sort of doctrine and other sort of attitudes towards different things, the land-based weapons are mostly just sort of kept on standby, and we honestly could do without the majority of them. As in, we don't need more than about 300 warheads either, but the Russians have 2,500, so we maintain about 1,500. I'll maybe put up the chart of the Russian versus U.S. warhead count. And again, like I said, we've been reducing for a long time, and they've been reducing. They kept building up after we reached our peak, but they also reached their peak in like 1980? Yeah, like 1985. They reached their peak warhead count, and they've been going down ever since. Because again, you don't really need more than about 300, because once you have a guidance system that's accurate enough to put it within a quarter mile of the target anywhere on Earth. You only really need 300 warheads of a few hundred kilotons apiece to, essentially reduce, your adversary and every other major civilization or every major, country on Earth to rubble, right? And there's just really no need to have anything past that. So it's truly, triply senseless. And I wish this weren't happening. And to me, this is more serious than everything else he has done, because, again, this will not stop just because he's out of office, right? If there's a drastic change in leadership in 2028, we can restore funding to all the scientific agencies, we can stop, all these draconian enforcement measures, we can reverse all the bad policy decisions, but not so with this, right? If we start testing, our adversaries will start testing, because they haven't yet. Again, a nuclear explosion is not a subtle event. Seismographs can pick them up the world over, and there's entire agencies dedicated to monitoring seismographs for potential nuclear weapons tests. This is why we know when North Korea conducts a test, it is a literal nuclear explosion. It does require sensitive equipment to detect it from thousands of miles away, but nonetheless it is very detectable because, again, it's a literal nuclear explosion. So we would know if Russia or China had conducted a test, and we would actually know with a pretty high degree of confidence. So there's no reason to believe that they have conducted a test. So there's no reason to believe they've conducted a test. We don't need to conduct any tests to know that our weapons work. And we don't really need any improvements to our weapons either, even if we did want to change them and therefore need to revalidate them. So it's every kind of senseless you can imagine, and it will have ramifications that persist long past the, current domestic political environment, because it'll only ramp back down once geopolitics gets a little bit more sort of, hold hands and sing kumbaya, which at the moment it is not. It is a very hostile, competitive global environment. So yeah. A lot of not very happy thoughts with this. But I want to get much as I could, get some of the technical information out there. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll probably make more follow-ups on this in the future because it's something that, for better or worse, I know a lot about, mostly due to just morbid fascination. Also from, learning about different sort of priorities and the safety culture at, working at Sandia. Although, again, my actual job did not involve any of these tests. So I'll probably will discuss it in the future, even though it's a horribly morbid topic. And so I'm just trying to disseminate accurate information as best I can. So, yeah, that's all I got.